Good day, students. Welcome to another lesson in economics. Today we are going to look at the includes as well as the excludes from GDP. Remember, we are still in chapter 10, which is on the measuring of the activities of the economy. Right, so let's look at what is included in GDP. Number one, we're talking of consumptions by households. So these can be goods and services that individuals buy or purchase. Can be when you go to Pick and Pay and you want to go buy bread. So that is part of consumptions by households and is part of GDP. When you take your car for a car wash, that's part of consumption and is part of GDP. Right. The next one is investments by businesses and households. We're talking of fixed assets for production. So when businesses or companies purchase machines, vehicles, and so on. For example, when Triumphant College purchased a bus, that's investment and is part of GDP. Inventories, again, they are part of GDP. Inventories, we are talking of the stock that businesses buy to sell, and we should not mix this up with intermediate goods. Intermediate goods, we are talking of the goods that are used in the process of producing the final goods, so the inputs. So those ones, they are not part of GDP, but inventories are part of GDP. New houses, so when you buy or purchase a new house, that is part of investment and is part of GDP. Right, and the next one is government expenditures. So with government expenditures, we're talking of construction of roads and schools or public lights and all that. So they are all part of government expenditure. Then the last one is net export. So net exports is actually the value of a country's export to other nations less the imports from other nations. So what we are trying to say here is that the exports of the country are actually part of GDP, but imports are deducted. So imports are not part of GDP. This is because when we define GDP, we say that is the value of all final goods produced within the country. And if you look at imports, those are the goods that are produced in other countries and sold in the country. So when you order your clothes from China, that's not included in our GDP because those clothes are not produced in Namibia but rather in China. So what we actually include is what we have produced. Although we have sold that to other countries, it's still part of our GDP. Right, so now let's look at what is excluded in GDP. So the first one, we are talking of intermediate goods. Now, intermediate goods, we say that are inputs or goods used to produce final goods. So this can be, for instance, if you are producing cars, so the parts that you use to produce a car, they're actually intermediate goods, and those parts will not be part of the GDP. So for example, maybe if you need wheels to produce a car, so those wheels, although maybe you bought them for, let's say, 20 or something, but you are going to use them to produce the car, so the wheels will not be part of GDP, but the final product, which is a car, will be part of GDP. Right, so the next one is used goods. Used goods, we are talking of second-hand goods. So we are saying that these goods are not included in GDP because they were already included when they were purchased as brand new. So now when you buy a cell phone, let's say an iPhone, a brand new iPhone from Apple Store, so that is recorded as GDP. But now when you decide to sell that phone to your friend and so on, it's no longer part of GDP because it was already recorded. If you record it again, it will be double counting, which we actually try to avoid by all means. Then the next one is underground production or black market production. So we're talking of the sales of drugs, prostitutions, and all those things that are done behind doors or in the dark. So those ones are not recorded in GDP because number one, we don't know what happens, and nobody will say, a drug dealer who cannot come and say that no, this is my business, I sell drugs illegally and so on. So that's why they are not recorded and they are not part of GDP. The next one is financial transactions. So financial transactions, we are talking of stocks, we're talking of bonds, we're talking of shares and all that. So when you buy, let's for example buy shares, that's not included in GDP because there's no production happening over there, but what you are doing is you're actually just buying ownership. You're just buying ownership, right? Right. The next one is household production. So I said that household production is also not part of GDP because it's not recorded. So when you buy, let's for example say cake mix to go make a birthday cake at home, so that is not recorded in GDP because it's the transaction or the production itself is not even recorded, right? Then the last one is transfer payments. Transfer payments, we are talking of the benefits that the government gives to the public or to the community. We're talking of pension funds. We're talking of other benefits, social benefits. We're talking of Harambe money and all that. So those are transfer payments and they are not part of GDP. We are talking of, for example, when Dr. Age gave $1 million to Boma, that is part of transfer payments and it's not recorded in GDP, right? So these are the items that are included as well as the items that are excluded in GDP. And this will take us to the end of our lesson today. If you have any question, do not hesitate to ask. I'll see you guys in the next lesson.